네, 그러면
Then we would like to begin the session 1. Please take your seat so that we can begin. Session 1 is titled Global Container Shipping. Eun-hyuk Lee of BPA will moderate the session. And we have two speakers for this session, Mr. Lars JENSEN, the CEO of Vasbus Maritime, and Mr. Hua Joo TAN of Liner Litica. Please welcome our two speakers and the moderator onto the stage with a big round of applause.
please come up to the stage. 네, 박수 타이밍이 조금 늦어서요.
Why don't we give it up for them once again? On the opportunities and challenges at the container shipping, I would like to hand over the microphone to the moderator. Let me introduce once again Eun-hyuk Lee, International Logistics Director of BPA, will moderate the session. Please welcome him with a big hand. And we are joined by Mr. Lars JENSEN, CEO of Vasbus Maritime. Please give him a big round of applause. And we are also joined by Hua Joo TAN, Mr. Hua Joo TAN of Liner Litica. Please give it up for him. Then why don't we begin?
Hello everyone, I'm Eun-hyuk, International Logistics Director of Busan Port Authority. First, housekeeping note. The first, our speaker, Lars JENSEN, will give first presentation. He'll be given 30 minutes. And then Mr. Hua Joo from Liner Litica, he'll be given 30 minutes. And then the rest 20 minutes will be engaged in Q&A sessions. So some of you watching the presentation, please note down the questions that bring to your brain. And someone who knows me, you can text me. Then I read it here, and then we'll give these questions to the speakers. So first, Lars, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, let me pass the podium to Mr. Lars JENSEN.
Thank you for the welcome, and thank you for bringing me back to Busan. As far as I could count, this is now the 5th BIPC I'm attending. I had the great honor to be here even at the very first BIPC when it was first launched. So thank you for having me here. Jumping into today's topic, as you can probably guess from my choice of picture here, the global container shipping industry is facing a large set of challenges and troubles. But as I was also saying, it's been mentioned a few times here today, the chaos we are faced with, we should not fear it. What we should do, and what we are actually doing as an industry, is we are overcoming the challenges. We are managing the chaos. If you look back during the pandemic, when global trade was the most disrupted, we also moved more containers globally than ever before in history. This industry thrives despite the chaos. We are good at managing the chaos. That's from an industry perspective. From the perspective of the individual companies, the chaos and disruption, and yes, there will be more chaos and disruption coming, is a source of competitive advantage. This is an industry that favors companies. Companies thrive if they are good at managing the chaos and disruption. So I'm going to present to you an image of challenges that's going to come ahead of us that will not get smaller, but don't fear them, embrace them, manage them, and thrive on them. Very, very quickly on the Red Sea status, there's really nothing new to report. As you will see slightly later on, the Red Sea crisis is a fundamental tenet of why the industry is where it is today, but in essence, there has been no change for the last 9 months. The situation is the same. It is risky to sail through the area. Most global container lines sail their big ships around Africa. Smaller regional niche lines, they do go through the area, and that's really how it has been since the middle of December last year. And presently, there are zero indications that this is going to change anytime soon. This is the new normal. How long can this last? The honest answer is no one knows. If you think a little through history, have we had the route closed before? Yes, we have. Mind you, it's the Red Sea, it's not the Suez Canal that's closed. But the closest we come is 2021 with Ever Given getting stuck. The Suez Canal was closed for 6 days. 1967, also trouble in the Middle East, the Suez Canal was closed for 8 years. So somewhere between 6 days and 8 years. Right now we are at 9 months. This could be over, not in a few months, but at least a number of months down the line, or this could last years. We don't know, but we need to manage the situation. Getting a little bit closer to where the market has been this year before we look at where it's going to go to. These are just a few examples of the spot rates out there. And in essence, this year has been characterized by two sudden and sharp peaks. The first one is the obvious one. That's the one where the Red Sea crisis erupted and everybody had to realign their supply chain. Spot rates spiked. As we got used to going around Africa, the market abated somewhat. Then we got a secondary spike. That was the onset of a very, very early peak season. This, to quite a degree, was demand-driven, but to some degree also driven by port congestion, because port congestion soaks up capacity. Market has now been going down for quite a while, and this is only natural because we had a very, very early peak. We are coming off that peak. It's likely going to continue downwards unless something else happens. That's basically where we are right now. Let's try to dig a little bit deeper into it. First, if we think in terms of demand, here's the issue. Demand can be viewed in very many different ways. And if you are prone to be optimists, if we measure the way the industry usually measures demand, just in TEU, the number of containers shipped, we get the number that the latest data here from July shows that the market has grown 5.5% compared to last year. And if that's all the information we are given, we would say 5.5% growth in TEU, that's actually a pretty healthy growth rate. Historically, based on where we should be, that should be fine. But that headline would to some degree be quite misleading. Sure, year on year is up 5.5%. But what if we do something else? What if we compare to 2019, before the pandemic disruptions, 5 years ago? In total, not per year, but in total, demand is up 5%. That's less than 1% per year on average for 5 years. This is not the hallmarks of strong growth. So strong growth can be somewhat deceiving. Then we get to the next stage. What if we don't think about the number of containers, but we take the sailing distance into account? So we measure TEU miles. Quite frankly, I've never understood why we don't use TEU miles in container shipping as a standard. We use ton miles over on the bulk sector, for example. And TEU miles this year is critical, because this is how we can capture the impact of suddenly going around Africa. And if we use this, we find that demand is not up 5%, it's up 25% year on year. And here we, of course, have a key understanding of why the market suddenly became as strong as it was. Global capacity, the global fleet, roughly grows 10% this year, but that's nothing compared to that 25% spike in TEU miles. As long as we go around Africa, it's the TEU miles that is the critically important parameter. And with that, we can then begin to go down the path of saying, well, how strong is the market then actually? And we can measure it in many different ways. Here I'm going to show you two, and let me show you the one first that is the wrong way of doing it. And the reason I'm going to mention that is you very often come across it. You'll very often come across, remember when I measured demand in TEU before, for example, I could say demand grew 5%. That would be an objective fact. I could also say the global fleet of container vessels grew 10%. In that case, supply-demand balance would be weakened because capacity outgrows demand. That should be fairly simple. Here's the problem. If I use that simple approach and try to measure what is the supply-demand balance in the world, you get the blue line up here. The dip you see in 2009, that's the consequence of the financial crisis a decade and a half ago. It was an absolutely awful time, especially for the container lines. But if I only measure TEU growth and fleet growth, we get to the weird conclusion that the market should have been crashed horribly for the last 10 years. It should be much, much worse than during the financial crisis. Not just now, but for years, which is obviously untrue. So something is wrong with that way of measuring. And there are two elements we need to capture. Ships are gradually going slower. As ships go slower, we need more vessels to move the same amount of cargo. That has to be taken into account. Port congestion. If we have port congestion, that means a number of vessels are tied up in queues outside of ports, soaking up capacity that's not available to the market. That should be taken into account as well. If we reassign the model and take slower speed and port congestion into account, we get the orange curve. That reflects the true state of the market much better. We had the big dip in 2009 following the financial crisis. We had a downturn in 2015, which was relatively standard, and then we had the spike during the pandemic. Much better model. With that model, we can now begin to contemplate where are we now and where will the market be going in the years ahead. Now, first of all, what I mentioned before, when we have port congestion and that delays vessels and that soaks up capacity. What I'm showing you here is the on-time performance, which is horrible. Before the pandemic, it's never been good. Before the pandemic, it was normal that somewhere between 70 and 80% of ships came on time. That was as good as we could do it. The pandemic crashed everything. The market gradually recovered. But here, because of the Red Sea crisis, we are still just around 50% of vessels that arrive on time. The ones that are late are on average 5 days or more late, which is pretty bad. And that also means that we are right now at a point where roughly 6% of all the vessel capacity in the world is unavailable. It has been soaked up by vessels in queues and delays throughout. That needs to be taken into account. So I promised you to say, where is the market then actually? Because the model before only took us to 2023. Step number one, let's play a little game. Let's assume the Red Sea crisis never happened, because that gives the true fundamental state of the market. The Red Sea is, let's call it, merely a distraction. So if we could still go through the Red Sea, this is where we would be. We would here in 2024 be at the bottom of a cyclical downturn. 2025 would not be much better. This is not necessarily a disaster in the market. Sure, if you are a container line, if it hadn't been for the Red Sea crisis, all the container lines would be loss-making this year. We could see that already in fourth quarter last year as we were approaching this issue. So the true state of the market right now is we are in a normal cyclical downturn. This is the bottom of the downturn. We have massive overcapacity. That's not going to be better next year. However, this is also where we should be lucky. Now, obviously, the container lines did not order overcapacity because they predicted the Red Sea. Nobody predicted the Red Sea. But we were lucky they did. It is this overcapacity that allows us to be able to redirect the supply chains to go around Africa. If we had not had overcapacity, we would right now be in a situation that would be much worse than anything we saw during the pandemic, because we would not have had the capacity to manage the current crisis. But we do, and here we are. So if we break this model down to a monthly level and try to do it a little bit more detailed, what you see here is a huge spike during 21 and 2022. That is the pandemic. This is when freight rates were astronomically high. The market was extremely tight. Then the market cooled off, demand dropped, and 22, 23 became much better. Then we see the secondary spike in 2024. This is the peak season. This is May, June, and July, where we had the early peak season come on top of all the operational challenges. But as you can also see, sure, we had challenges. We had the same pressure as during the pandemic, but it was a lot more short-lived this time around. The market is already coming down from the perspective of supply and demand, which also matches with the decline I showed you before in the freight rates. If we then try to look forward to 2025, this is where we need to contemplate what will happen with the Red Sea. This one is based on the assumption that the Red Sea reopens on 1st of January 2025. Increasingly, that might be unlikely, but that's at least what this one graph is showing us. If that happens, we will instantaneously get back into overcapacity because the market fundamentals haven't changed. We are still in the middle of a normal cyclical downturn. We have too much capacity. Does that mean that the markets will proverbially crash in January if it reopens? Actually, it does not. There's going to be a temporary period because when we reopen the Red Sea, all the vessels that will start to go through Suez again, the first ones, they will overtake the vessels that are already going around Africa. So we are going to see a surge of vessels arriving simultaneously, both in Europe and in Asia. This is going to provide a lot of pressure on ports, more so in Europe than out here in Asia. So we're going to have several months when the Red Sea opens. Everybody will celebrate. The Red Sea is reopened. That is a good news, and it is. But it will lead to massive congestion problems, especially in Europe, that will take several months to work through. We need to be prepared for that as well. So it's not going to be an instant transition to overcapacity. But what then, you might ask, what if the Red Sea is not resolved in January? What if this lasts all of 2025? Could we then expect a similar tight peak season in 2025 as the one we just saw? The answer to that is actually no. If we project onwards to 2025, we still have to go around Africa. Sure, we get a peak season, and it's a fairly normal peak season. The reason being we are still getting more vessels delivered that are going to be phased into the networks. So we are managing the Red Sea crisis. Again, we are lucky that the carriers over-ordered. That is what allows us to manage the crisis. But in the absence of any other problems arising, the outlook for 2025 is for a much more balanced market than what we saw in peak season this year, even if we still have the Red Sea crisis. Now, I say in the absence of any other problems, and certainly we can hope that there should be no other problems. But there will be problems. I already talked about the turmoil when the Red Sea reopens, vessels overtaking each other, massive port congestion in Europe. And mind you, there's going to be more dominoes falling from this. If we have massive port congestion in Europe, the first thing the shipping lines will do is they will say to the ports, don't load any empty containers, because then you can turn the vessels quicker, which would make sense from a European perspective. But that then in turn means that 2 months after the Red Sea reopens, what's going to happen out here? Vessels will arrive with no empty containers on board. And you're going to have a temporary period of potentially a shortfall in equipment out in Asia. So the ripples from the reopening will work their way through the system, at least over a half-year period. And then we have an event that seems more and more likely to potentially happen just 1 week from now. That would be a strike on the US East Coast. There is still a full-on confrontation. It still appears that the union and the terminal organizations are not talking together. And we are already now beginning to see practical repercussions. We are seeing some carriers that are now skipping a few planned ports on the US East Coast, just dumping all cargo in one and the same port to make sure the vessels don't get stalled. And do not underestimate the potential magnitude of this. We have not had a strike on the US East Coast since 1977, which means we can't really go back in history and learn from what happened back then, because at that point in time, containerization itself was only in its infancy. So if we are to get a handle on what would the impact be on this, is there anything else we can learn from? And it turns out there is, because on the US West Coast, there are 2 instances we can learn from, 2015 and 2002. In 2015, there was a failure to reach an agreement between the terminals and the union on the West Coast. It did not lead to a major strike. What it did was lead to go-slow actions. So you had laborers, yeah, they came to work, but everything was done a lot slower than usual. And sometimes maybe one terminal would be shut for 1 day. That go-slow action created some of the worst congestion we up until then had seen on the US West Coast. Within a relatively short span of time, you had 40 big ships lying in queue just outside Los Angeles. That's still only about half of what we saw in the pandemic, but it happened rapidly. If I try to model this level of disruption, go slow alone in that period almost instantaneously soaked up 2% of world capacity in terms of ships. 2% of world capacity might not sound like much, but keep in mind we are in a situation now where, at least up until during the peak, we did not have any excess capacity in the world because we had to go around Africa. If we go back to 2002, that's actually a more relevant comparison. In 2002, all ports on the US West Coast were completely closed for 10 days. After 10 days, the US government intervened and forced the terminals to be reopened. That cost at the time the US economy somewhere between $6 and $19 billion. It's a large gap because you can try to measure this in many different ways. If we fast forward to a strike on the US East Coast, this is likely then going to cost the US economy somewhere between $1.5 and $5 billion per day that the strike is going on. So that is what we are faced with. Also note that in 2002, this was in between presidential election cycles. It was President Bush at the time who invoked the Taft-Hartley Act, which allows them to stop a strike. But that was only after 10 days. This time around, it's a lot more complicated. We are right now in the middle of a US presidential campaign. Interfering or not interfering in the strike will immediately be seen as part of the presidential election campaign. If President Biden decides to intervene and stop the strike, that will very likely by the opponents, by the Republicans, be said as say, well, this is the US administration acting in favor of the profits of foreign companies at the expense of American workers. That would be how the politics would play out. So if we get a strike, there's a high likelihood it's going to last a while before we see that kind of intervention. The intervention would likely only happen when there is sufficient pain to be felt throughout the American society, which might take a couple of weeks. And how long does it then take to clear? Now we had a strike, now the strike is over. Well, then you're going to have a pile of vessels and cargo that sit outside the port and now needs to be managed. At the same time, we continue to see more vessels arrive into the ports that, of course, also need to be managed. So the only way you can manage this excess pool is with whatever excess capacity you have in the terminals. Now, measuring capacity in a container terminal, it's a little bit like measuring elastic band by the meter. You can get a lot of different numbers depending on how you do it. If I sit down and look back over the last couple of years at all the US East Coast ports and say, well, how much cargo did they handle at their very, very peak a couple of years ago? Say that at least is the amount of excess capacity we have. Then they have about 15% excess capacity. That means for every 1 day of strike, it's going to take at least 6 days to clear the backlog. So if we get a 2-week strike, you're going to look at major disruptions into 2025 before this is even cleared. And keep in mind again here the time delay effect. The moment US East Coast ports are shut down, vessels stop. That will not immediately be felt around the world, but with 2 weeks of time delay, these vessels are not arriving on their Atlantic services back in Europe. Then Europe Atlantic exports will feel it. 5, 6, 7 weeks later, you will feel it out here, because it's with that time delay that the vessels that got stuck in the US East Coast are then not going to arrive out here. So this is going to be a ripple. And in Asia, you will feel it this way, that let's say the strike lasts for 2 weeks. Operationally, you won't really feel anything while the strike is ongoing because the normal vessels are still here. Then the strike stops, let's say, after 2 weeks. Then everything is fine for 3 weeks. Then you get the problem out here. Remember this time delay effect, that it takes a long time for the problems to migrate through the system and arrive out here. Another element, and I wouldn't put that in the category of problems, that's merely the new alliance setup. Keep in mind, it is normal that alliances get reshaped. They usually live 5, 6, 7 years, then we get a reshaping of the alliance landscape. Now we're going through that process again. From that perspective, it's not really that unusual. So now we get Gemini with their Hapag and Maersk. Ocean Alliance continues unchanged. Premier Alliance, that's what used to be called THE, but now with Hapag out, they call themselves Premier Alliance. MSC operates as standalone. Oh, well, at least to some degree. They have some slot swap agreements with Premier Alliance on some of their Asia-Europe services, but not all of them. And they also have some slot swap agreements with ZIM on the Pacific into the US East Coast. Does this change the landscape very much? To be quite honest, not that much. It changes a little bit, and there are some nuances that are important. Overall, in the setup all the carriers are coming out with now, we are seeing basically 2 more Asia-Europe services and 2 more Pacific services. If we resolve the Red Sea crisis, it'll be 3 more Asia-Europe services, 3 more Pacific services. In itself, that is not a massive capacity injection. You can question, especially if we resolve the Red Sea crisis, is that going to create overcapacity? Likely, yes, it is. What I find more interesting is the diversity of service concepts we have out there. Gemini is at one extreme end. They are extremely focused on very few and large port calls in Asia, in Europe, and in North America, and have instead set up what they call shuttles, which, let's call it a hybrid between a mainline and a feeder service. That's a new type of service concept they've come up with. Their approach to this is, they say that will allow them to better control the port operations to also provide a much more reliable service. At the other end of the extreme, we have especially MSC services, and on the Pacific also Ocean Alliance, that has a much larger number of direct port-port combinations. So the span of different services that are offered to shippers out there changes significantly. But make no mistake, when we say, for example, MSC has a much larger number of direct services, that does not matter. That does not mean that every service is suddenly direct. It is not. Even in the case of MSC's standalone service and also with Ocean Alliance over on Trans-Pacific, more than half of the port pair combinations, that's even between the major ports, still don't have a direct service. So even with these new service concepts, there will still be a large amount of transshipment that is going to be needed. That was basically what I said already, so let's just work through those ones relatively quickly. And let me instead summarize what are some of the main challenges and also the increasing challenges that we're going to be faced with. The Red Sea crisis is now highly likely to continue into 2025. The recent escalation of violent actions between Israel and Lebanon up in southern Lebanon almost guarantees that this conflict, and therefore also the Red Sea problem, will persist into 2025. On the positive side, the Panama Canal is basically back to normal. What could be seen as even more positive is it appears the Panamanian government will finally execute on their more than 10-year-old plan to increase the size of the available reservoirs of water to prevent such a problem in the future. But for now, the Panama Canal is basically good. But what we should plan for is increasing geopolitical turmoil. I don't see the Red Sea crisis as a standalone problem. This is a symptom of more problems to come. The world has become multipolar. It's not a matter of the world is going to be multipolar, it already is. We got some very large, self-assured governments around the world. Just to mention a few random ones of them, that would be China, it would be India, it would be Brazil, it would be South Africa. We could go on. We have a world where increasingly a lot of different countries look at the world from the perspective that they do what is in their own best interest. They don't necessarily see the need to align or placate other countries. That means a more unstable world. It does mean more geopolitical turmoil. And that's why I also started out with saying we shouldn't necessarily fear this chaos, but we should plan for it. If you work in the supply chain industry, if we are being slightly cynical, problems tend to be good for business because that makes supply chains more difficult to manage, and therein lies more business opportunities. It also means that the concept we've had for decades where we tend to fear overcapacity, carriers would fear overcapacity of ships, terminals would fear building overcapacity in their terminals because that was seen as loss-making. That is also what provides the contingency to actually act when we have these crises, Red Sea crisis being case in point. The supply chains will see increasing costs from decarbonization, and the very short-term and practical in the European Union, there's a ramp-up of the ETS, which is the carbon taxation on shipping. There's also new regulations forcing shipping lines to use biofuel. All of this will add costs. There might be more regulation in individual countries coming. There's a major gathering a week from now in the IMO the 82nd MEPC meeting, where basically they're trying to see can they come up with more decarbonization regulation. I'm not that confident that they will actually end up with more global regulation. You're likely going to see more regional regulation like the one we saw in the EU going forward. A single word more on the US presidential campaign, because that's going to be important for our industry too. If you look at the two parties, both the Republicans and Democrats are running on platforms to increase tariffs. However, there's a big difference in scale. If we get a Trump-elected president, there is a significant likelihood that you will see a massive increase in tariffs, especially against China. My expectation is, if Trump gets elected, you are going to see a huge boom, short-term, but huge boom in demand out of Asia immediately after he gets elected. Because that will be the tiny window where US importers can say, let's import a lot of goods before Trump takes office towards the end of January and implements new tariffs. So we could get a secondary boom. To some degree, that will coincide with an early lead-up towards Chinese New Year. So we could get this spike towards the end of the year, depending on how this plans out. We've already touched a lot on the potential strike on the US East Coast. If that strike persists for a couple of weeks and soaks up capacity, this, in my view, could very well act as a trigger point. We could risk spot rates increasing again, and in worst case, if this strike really drags on, we could see a repeat of the pandemic. Some of the wildcards out there, let's not belabor the points. We have challenges brewing in the South China Sea. We have challenges brewing in the Strait of Taiwan. We have problems related to the Strait of Hormuz. We still have a major container vessel being held hostage by the Iranians. There is no shortage of these problems in the world. But of all these problems, if I was to finish on just one problem, which I still think is not taken sufficiently serious around the world, given the repercussions, the risk of cyber attacks. Yes, they still do happen. Yes, they are still destructive. And seen from the perspective of the supply chain industry, holds the largest risk potential as I see out there. That was at least how I chose to tee up the ball. So I'm looking forward to the questions. And once again, thank you very much for inviting me back to Busan.
Thank you, Lars. The presentation was very insightful. And probably the audience will have a lot of questions. And we will have a separate Q&A session. So let me open the podium for Mr. Hua Joo. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So I would like to re-emphasize a couple of the points that Lars has spoken about earlier, but with specific data that we have prepared. Now, if there's one chart that can explain what's happened to the container shipping market in the last 4 years, I think this chart would be the one. Now, what this chart shows is the total global capacity of container ships over the last 4 years, and you can see that the global capacity has been growing quite significantly, especially in this last 12 months. But what's more important in this chart is really to look at the yellow shaded area here, because if you look at what happened in 2021 and 2022 during the peak of the pandemic, you will see that the yellow areas has actually declined. What that area shows is the active capacity that's actually moving around the world. And because of that reduction in the active capacity, a large part of that driven by the fact that port congestion reached a record high during that period, what we had was negative supply growth during those years. And coupled with the very high demand that we saw during the pandemic years, that was what caused the significant surge in ocean freight rates at that time. Now, right now, what we have is a similar situation that's developing. And what's driving it this time is essentially the Red Sea crisis. And you can see on this chart here that over the last 12 months, although nominal supply growth has increased by almost 11%, the active supply growth has only increased by 1.5%. And that has caused a significant constraint on the supply side in the market this year. And what is causing this difference between the nominal growth and the actual growth is very clearly here, the rise in the number of ships diverted away from the Red Sea, which you can see represented by the black shaded area here. And that has taken out effectively 7% of the global fleet. On top of that, there's another 2% that's been taken out because of the rise in port congestion, partly also due to the Red Sea crisis. But as you will see later, also on the demand side, there's actually been real growth on some of the trade lanes that's also driving port congestion. So again, it's very important to recognize here what's happening on the supply side. Now, we have been tracking the Red Sea diversions from the end of last year when the crisis first started, and you will see on this chart here a measurement of the total number of ships as well as TEU capacity that has been diverted away from the Suez Canal to the Cape of Good Hope, and that would be the area represented by the light blue area on this map here. What we capture here is the number of ships that's in that light blue area, and you will see that since January of this year, the total supply of ships that's been diverted has remained fairly consistent. And I do expect, and I agree with what Lars said here, that this Red Sea crisis is unlikely to be resolved in the near term. So I would expect that this continuation of this diversion to the Cape is going to continue perhaps well into next year as well. But I think it's also important to quantify exactly how much capacity has been diverted because of this. And this is the measure that we have made right now. If we look at the incremental capacity on the 5 major trade lanes that's been affected by the Red Sea diversions, what we have right now is more than 160 ships with a total supply TEU capacity of 2.1 million TEUs that's been added because of this Red Sea diversion. And that 2.1% represents 7% of the global fleet. Now, it's important to remember this number because the 2.1 million TEUs or 7% is also the amount of supply that will return to the market the moment the Red Sea crisis is resolved. And you might have seen some suggestions that this number could be as high as 15 or 20%. Now that's not correct because the actual number is actually what I've measured here, which is 7%. But it's still a significant number because within 1 to 2 months of the resolution of the Red Sea, this is the amount of supply that will come back to the market, and that's going to be a game changer because we will have an almost immediate oversupply situation develop as a result of that. Now, if you look at what's happening, again, in terms of deployment across most of the long-haul trade routes this year, you will see that there has been a significant growth in the Red Sea affected areas, which is mainly Asia, North Europe, and Asia Med, which is represented on this chart with the red and orange lines. But on top of that, there's also been significant growth in a number of trade lanes that are not affected by the Red Sea. And you see here, in particular, the Asia to US West Coast, as well as Asia to Latin America, demand has been significantly strong this year. If we compare where we are today versus September last year, Asia to US West Coast and Asia to Latin America demand has grown by 20 to 30%. That's a significant amount of growth coming at a point when supply is extremely constrained in the market right now. So again, this is what is causing the surge in the ocean freight market this year. Now, if we contrast that against the intra-regional trade routes, you will see that there's been no growth. In fact, there's been negative growth on the intra-regional trade routes, especially in the intra-Asia. In the case of Busan, for example, you will see that there's been a drop in the number of services on the short sea trade lanes between Korea and China, as well as Korea and Japan, and even Korea and Russia volumes are down this year. So it's important to contrast this again. We have very strong growth on the Red Sea related trades, also on the US related trades. A lot of the growth in Latin America is coming from Mexico. Much of this Mexican cargo is eventually going to end up in the US as well. So that has been the biggest positive driver behind the market demand side this year. On the short sea side, it's been relatively weak so far. Now, what this next chart shows is the global port congestion situation, again, over this last 4-year period. And you will see that there was a significant surge in port congestion during the 2021-22 COVID period. But since then, that has come down. Since the start of the Red Sea crisis last year, we have seen an increase in port congestion again. And that has added an extra 2% globally in terms of capacity that's taken away because of the rise in port congestion. Certainly, if you look at ports in Southeast Asia earlier this year, as well as India and Middle East, that was largely driven by the Red Sea crisis. But also, there's been a significant increase in port congestion in Latin American ports, especially in areas around Mexico, Panama, and Brazil. And again, that's driven by the significant surge in demand in those areas. That's also contributed to the significant increase that we've seen in congestion this year. But there is one major difference between what happened 2 years ago versus what we're seeing right now, and that is what's happening in the US. You will see that in the US, back in 2021 and 2022, there was a significant surge in congestion, especially around the LA Long Beach area. And that's represented by the orange area in this chart here. That's almost completely absent this year. There's been no signs of congestion in LA Long Beach right now. But this situation could change quite dramatically as we get closer to the potential strike in the US East Coast. Now again, if there is a strike in the East Coast starting for next week, 1st of October, again, what we have done is to quantify exactly how much of the supply would be stuck at the US East Coast ports. And for each week that the strike persists, it's going to take out 1.7% of the global fleet. That's how much of the global supply is currently in the US East Coast at any week. And if this strike were to persist and last beyond a month or more, that impact on the global supply side would be as high as 15%. That's how much cumulatively the amount of capacity right now that is going to the US East Coast would be if there is a strike that lasts for more than 4 weeks. Now, of course, before we get to that 15% number, the ships would already start to divert. And the only real option for these ships would be to divert to the US West Coast. And we are going to get very close to a situation where the West Coast capacity will not be able to absorb most of this diversion away from the East Coast, and we could see potentially another blow up in US port congestion by the end of the year. Now, the problem with the US East Coast situation is that I don't expect to see an easy solution to this problem, because the ILA has stated very clearly and very publicly that they do intend to strike on the 1st of October. And there is really zero incentives on the part of the USMX, which is the port employer side, to agree to the terms that the ILA is demanding, especially given that the market is potentially going to benefit significantly, or at least from the shipping lines perspective. Any disruptions in the US East Coast is going to be positive for the shipping lines. So there is really no good incentive for the shipping lines to agree to the port labor demands. So the only solution that could come is potentially going to be a political one. And given that we have a very tight race in the US presidential elections this year, and given how close we are to the election date, I do not expect that there will be an easy solution to this. Again, I don't think that the media in general has paid sufficient attention to how big this potential problem could become. So again, if you look at the breakdown of this US East Coast volumes, almost half of that is going to be affecting cargo originating from Asia. That's about 45% of all cargo volumes would be coming from Far East Asia. There's also a significant amount coming from South America, especially refrigerated goods for cargo such as bananas and fruits, for example. That accounts for around 20% of the US East Coast volumes, another 20% from the Atlantic side. So it's going to affect significant segments of the market that's not just limited to the Asian origins. So again, this could be a significant problem which we are only a week away from. Now, with that as background, I want to move on to what to expect for the rest of this year, as well as potentially beyond this. Now, if you look at the supply side growth, the good news here is that we have already passed the peak of new ship deliveries. And that peak was in the second quarter of this year, where new ship deliveries was more than 300,000 TEUs per month. Now, right now, the rate of new ship deliveries have slowed to around 250,000 TEUs a month, and that number will drop further to 150,000 TEUs a month by next year. And you can see over the next 4 years, the number of new deliveries is going to be lower compared to what we had in the previous quarter. Now, in annualized terms, again, if we will get close to 10% of supply growth by the end of this year, and that is a record high number, certainly in TEU terms, but in percentage terms, we have not seen such a high level of growth since the end of the mid-2000s. But the good news here is that for the next 4 years, the level of supply growth is going to come down quite significantly, because from 2025 until 2028, the amount of new supply coming in annually will be between 4 to 5%. And certainly a 4 to 5% supply growth is going to be much more manageable for the market compared to the 10% growth that we had this year. Now, of course, this is contingent on the fact that we will not have a resolution of the Red Sea crisis. Again, to my point earlier, if the Red Sea crisis comes back or is resolved, we will get 7% of the global supply coming back almost immediately, and that is going to change this whole equation again. Now, I think it's important to understand what are the competitive dynamics that's driving this growth in supply. And what I show on this chart is the development of the capacity of the top 10 carriers in the market. And again, the one thing that I think would strike most of us is the tremendous growth that MSC has taken, especially in this last 5 years. And in significant contrast to MSC also, you will see how little the former number one line, which was Maersk, has grown over the same period. They've been essentially stagnant during that period. And to me, I think it's a major strategic error on the part of Maersk to have allowed MSC to overtake them and widen the gap by such a large amount during this period, especially if you consider that the last 4 years certainly has been the biggest and most profitable time for container shipping in its entire history. And for carriers such as Maersk to lose market share in such a big way cannot be acceptable by any measure. But what's interesting here is that MSC has very clearly thrown the challenge to the rest of the market because they have grown by such a massive scale, and that growth has not even ended because there's still a significant new capacity that MSC is going to receive over the coming 4 years. And that's certainly going to put a lot of pressure on the rest of the market, and that would also include Maersk, but certainly that's not limited to Maersk. There's going to be pressure on almost all of the other carriers in this list to try and at least keep up with what MSC is doing. And therefore, I think this is going to drive the next wave of new ship orders. And we've certainly seen the start of that in the last couple of months. If you look at the amount of new capacity that's been ordered last month, which is August this year, there's been a significant surge of new supply that's been ordered. In terms of the order book, we've increased from 20% to 25%, all within this last 4 months. And again, back to my point on the competitive pressure that all of the lines are facing, you will see here the list of the top 12 carriers and how much new supply each one of them are expected to receive over the next 4 years. And I think it's important to look at names like HMM, for example. HMM has on your right-hand side, in the middle portion there, a very small order book as it stands now. Of course, HMM has also recently announced their midterm expansion plans, and that will see significant new investments being put on new capacity. But that is not the only one that's going to be under pressure to add supply. If you look at this chart here, the number of carriers that will be under pressure includes names like Yangming, Hapag-Lloyd, certainly PIL, Zim, that has almost no new capacity coming beyond this year. But it's also going to put pressure on names like Maersk, for example. Even though Maersk does have some ships currently on order, relative to its current size, the Maersk order book is significantly behind the rest of the market. And this is going to put a lot of pressure on them as well. Which then brings me to this development of the new alliance this year. And what's triggered this, of course, was the breakup of the 2M that was announced earlier last year. And that's, I think, is going to be a significant game changer for the market next year. But certainly between now and next year, what this is going to drive in the market is the fact that nobody is going to give up market share between now until the end of January. Before the new alliance comes into place, there's going to be massive competition between the carriers to try and protect their market share before this reshuffling of the alliance. And that, I think, is going to be negative, barring what we're seeing on the US East Coast. But again, if you compare the actors in this game here, MSC and Maersk, that big gap that's developed between them, but also interesting to look at what's happened with Hapag-Lloyd as well, because if you look at the two partners in Gemini, Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk happens to be the least expansionist carrier in this last 7 years. That's certainly the case for Maersk since 2017, since the acquisition of Hamburg Süd. Maersk has stopped growing. But that was also the case with Hapag-Lloyd to a large extent, because since the acquisition or the merger with UASC, Hapag-Lloyd has also stopped growing. So the combination of Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd in Gemini is actually putting together two of the weakest carriers in the market right now. And I don't think that Gemini as an alliance is going to be a strong one. And again, I think it's very important, especially when it comes to Maersk, given how much Maersk has shifted their strategies in recent years, to read what Maersk is saying with a large pinch of salt. And certainly you have to read between the lines on what Maersk has been saying, because in January of last year, if you recall when the announcement of the 2M breakup was made, Maersk said very clearly that they intended to work as an independent carrier. But very quickly, by the end of last year, that shifted again, and they announced the Gemini Corporation this year. And again, what Maersk meant when they said that they would prefer to work independently was that they can't work with MSC anymore. And that was triggered by the fact that the moment MSC overtook Maersk, it became very clear that Maersk is no longer the dominant partner in the 2M. And what they needed was a new alliance that would allow them to keep that dominant partner position. And that was what they found in Hapag-Lloyd. And the problem here is that I think Hapag-Lloyd has put themselves in a very weak bargaining position, especially if you look at the terminal footprint between the three carriers here. If you look at MSC and Maersk, you will see a lot of overlap between the terminals that these two 2M partners currently operate. But you will see that in the case of Hapag-Lloyd, there's almost zero overlap in this, because most of the major hubs in the Gemini partnership will be a Maersk terminal, not a Hapag-Lloyd terminal. And very clearly in this partnership, there is a significant mismatch, I think, against Hapag-Lloyd in this case. And again, to my point earlier, I don't think that the Maersk network is a particularly strong one, especially if you look at the Trans-Pacific. On the US West Coast, for example, the Gemini partnership will only have 4 sailings a week. That's a significantly weaker position compared to Ocean Alliance, for example, that will have 12 sailings a week, and against the Premier Alliance that will have 10. Very clearly, Gemini is going to be the weakest out of the 4 new partnerships that's emerging next year. And even on Asia-Europe, you will see that the new hub and spoke network that Gemini is proposing on Asia-Europe, they are pitching this as a new innovation. Now, that's not correct, because a hub and spoke network has been around for the last 50 years. When container shipping was first introduced in Asia, that was how the first carriers operated using hub and spoke networks. And this has evolved over the last 40, 50 years as the network and the scale of operations in some of these secondary ports have evolved. You start to see more direct hauls being added to the long-haul trade routes. And what Gemini is trying to do is to reverse this process of adding more direct ports. They're actually reducing the number of direct ports. And again, I think that is going to be a problem. And I don't think that this is the actual way forward. What is driving the design of the Gemini network, I would argue, is due more to the fact that these 2 carriers are very short of ships. Again, if you refer to the earlier chart there, these 2 carriers has been the least expansionist carriers in the last 7 years, and they do have a problem because they do not have sufficient tonnage to build a denser network that will be able to compete effectively with the other alliances, and therefore they had to design a compromised network, which is what we have right now. And that network, they are pitching in terms of increased reliability, which is certainly possible, but it's going to come at a significant cost. There's always going to be a trade-off. And the problem here is I think that this new network is going to be uncompetitive, more in terms of the extra network cost that it will incur. And we have seen that previously in the case of Daily Maersk, for those who has been in this market long enough. When the Daily Maersk was first announced, it was pitched as a absolutely reliable service. And one of the biggest problems, and I've listed the full list of issues with the Daily Maersk product when it was first launched. One of the major issues is the fact that the market doesn't pay a premium for a more reliable service. I think this was one of the biggest reasons behind the failure of the Daily Maersk. And I see the same problems will still affect the Gemini product as well. And so if you contrast what Maersk has done with Gemini against what MSC has done, I very much prefer the new MSC approach, because if you look at the newly announced tie-up between MSC and the Alliance, or the new Premier Alliance, as well as with Zim, I think it's a win-win for all the partners there, because on the one hand, they have access to a more denser network, a more complete network with more direct port calls. There is no need to build a new and very expensive shuttle network and feeder network, both in Asia and in Europe. But also, equally importantly, this new partnership allows all of the carriers to retain operational independence. Each of the lines are able to retain their own operations within all of the main trade lanes. And again, I would prefer this approach to what I would prefer the MSC approach to what Maersk has done with this new Gemini network. And again, if you compare in terms of the number of services, how complete each of these alliances will be, you will see that Gemini actually has the smallest number of services or sailings per week on all of the major trade lanes. And that's going to put Gemini in a very disadvantageous position relative to the market. And again, I think it will be interesting to see what will happen under this new configuration when it starts next year. I think there will be winners and losers when the time comes. And ultimately, I think the best measure to gauge or to judge who the winners are is in how much money each of these carriers are making. And if you look at this measure, I think the Maersk position is an extremely weak one. If you look at where Maersk stands today, they are right at the very bottom, and they've been consistently in the bottom half in terms of profit margins in the last 5 years. It's been 7 years since they shifted to this new integrated logistics integrator strategy. That 7 years, I think, is more than enough to prove whether that strategy is working or not. And right now, it is quite clear, if you just look at the financial results, that that strategy is not working out. So I will stop here for now. I think we have still some time for Q&A.
Yes, fortunately, we have 17 minutes left. But, well, before I say further, thank you for a very insightful presentation. 2 years ago, Lars JENSEN, Mr. Tanaju, attended this conference and told me that he needs more minutes because back then we gave 10 to 15 minutes to all speakers. And he said, it's too short, I want to say more. So this time, we gave these two gentlemen 30 minutes each. So I think that was well worth the time. And I made a very good decision. I'm sure the audience were not bored at all. It was very interesting. And at the start, I told you that those who know my phone number, just give me a text message, and they did. And while I'm giving that question first, you can keep giving your questions, those who know my phone number. And those who don't know my phone number, raise your hands and ask questions. First off, well, it seems that you do have a little different opinion on Gemini. I think it's Mr. Tan is too harsh on Gemini configuration. And Lars JENSEN, in many other postings, I noticed that he mentioned several times that the keeping the schedule reliability of 90% that Gemini argued is workable. But he didn't mention it's commercially viable. So I'd like to hear first from Lars about the Gemini's success.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I tend to agree with Hua Joo that the network design there is driven by the scarcity of ships that they have. So what do you do when you don't have enough ships? Is it going to be commercially viable? To me, that hinges on one thing. Are they able to reduce the operating costs in operating the network itself? Because it's clear that with more transshipment, obviously comes higher transshipment costs. The only way to outweigh that is if you can maintain an extremely high degree of vessel utilization, not just on the deep sea vessels, but also on the shuttle vessels. That is going to be absolutely key. In terms of the reliability aspect, when I look at, again, not the last 4 years, because the last 4 years were weird, but when you look at how carriers tended to operate pre-pandemic, they should be able to pull off the reliability if they want. But I don't believe they're going to be able to have a commercially viable product if they believe people will pay a premium for reliability. The commercial viability of this concept would have to come through. Can they actually fill not just the main vessels, but also the shuttles, and not just on that one key lake where you go from, say, Asia to Europe, but also the lakes in between. So it's the cost element here that's going to be deciding. But I wouldn't write them off completely as it is now.
And I have one question. This is a question from the audience. That for the last few weeks and month, there was a report in Korean press that Gemini they stopped making Europe mainline service calling at Busan port, and Busan port might become a feeder port, and workers. So workers are very worried about the volume decline, and if no volume, no work. So that that article concerned many people, and do you? I think Lars is the right person to say this. So do you think that because of the Gemini's new attempt, Busan port would be in the negative side?
Not to a massive degree. I mean, sure, there might be some volumes that's going to be diverted for transshipment elsewhere. Obviously, the captive cargoes still go in and out of Busan. So whilst you can say in the nuances, sure, there might be a little bit of loss, I don't see that as having necessarily a major impact on Busan as such.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And another question is that the Premier Alliance. Now, the strike in the East Coast, this question points to two gentlemen, both. I think this time Mr. Tan comes first. What do you think? What's going to impact HMM and Premier Alliance if the strike on East Coast happens?
Now, if there is a East Coast strike, I think it's going to impact all the East Coast carriers equally. Now, of course, Asia, as I mentioned, accounts for 45%, and that's where most of the Asian carriers are focused on. But there's also a significant amount of Caribbean and Latin American cargo, that's 20%, another 20% on the transatlantic side. So the impact, I think, is going to have an equal weight for all carriers operating on the US East Coast. It's not just a HMM or Premier Alliance problem. It's going to impact all carriers equally, depending on the level of exposure that they have.
Lars?
Yeah, I would agree it tends to impact all equally, but there's also another ramification. If the strike goes on, say, for a week or beyond, what you can easily imagine is, say, you have a bunch of vessels that's coming from Asia through the Panama Canal up to the US East Coast. What carriers would be increasingly likely to do is to take that US East Coast cargo and discharge it in the Caribbean, not on the US East Coast, discharge it in places like Cartagena, in Panama, in Kingston, in Caucedo, in Freeport, because that at least would allow them to turn some of those vessels and send them back. This could create problems, not just for US East Coast, but for the whole Latin American trade pattern as well.
I think the person who asked this question really cares about HMM. He said, what's the contingency measures that HMM can take?
None.
Okay.
That was a slightly short answer, right? But in reality, the contingency measures that anyone could take is move the cargo into the US before the strike. Those were measures that should have been taken by shippers a month and a half ago. When we get a strike now, we're in full-on damage control mode.
Mm-hmm. And the other question is, this is not actually a question. This is my personal view, and I like to hear your take on this. The shippers prefer direct service, definitely, but there's a view that because of these days, the vessels getting bigger and bigger, and 24K vessels are too large, but the quay walls and berth and yard in modern terminals, they are not ready for the big ships. And the big ships comes, instantly the terminals are paralyzed, most of the ports here too. So however you try, you will end up with low productivity and low schedule reliability. So isn't there any, can we think that Gemini's attempt might be another alternative way to overcome this issue?
No, I think that Gemini's attempt is trying to get the best out of a situation. That's not for Gemini. That's the view I had on the entire industry for the past 10 years. We should never have gone beyond the, say, 15, 16,000 TEU vessels. When you look at the impact it has on the supply chain, the mega vessels, I'm not sure it was the right step for the industry. It would have been more effective had we had slightly smaller, again, 14, 15, 16,000, then had a more fine-grained network with more services. But that's just not where we are. Reality is we do have the big ships, and then it's a matter of how can you make the most out of those? And that's to some degree one of the problems Gemini is trying to address. I don't know if you see that differently, Hua Joo.
Yeah, again, I think the Gemini attempt is trying to move back the clock. And the good news is I don't think it will succeed. Because if you look at the earlier question on the loss of the number of calls in Busan by Gemini, the good news is none of the other three alliances is taking that step. And I think that is going to be the trend as we move forward. I think the trend is going to be more direct calls rather than less, especially as volumes grow in some of these emerging markets, and certainly Vietnam is one very good example of a feeder port that has now become a very critical direct port call as well for a large number of carriers. And so again, for Maersk and Gemini to be shifting to this hub and spoke approach, I think is a step backwards, not a step forward. And I don't think that this is going to be sustainable in the longer run. And certainly by the time Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd get sufficient number of new tonnage into their network within the next 4 or 5 years, I think this system is going to change again.
Hua Joo, Mr. Tan, if you look at the transit timetable that Gemini released from Busan to Rotterdam, it shows that it will guarantee 90% probability that it will arrive in 31 days from Busan to Rotterdam. But Shanghai to Rotterdam is 32 or 33 days. Qingdao to Rotterdam, 32 days. And Qingdao, Shanghai, they're in longer distance from Busan. So, well, isn't it safe to say that, in a sense, Korean shippers, exporting shippers, have a choice of diversity, more diverse choice? Before, they didn't have a choice, but they have now faster choice. The choice they can move their cargo faster. What's your take on that?
Yes, so a hub and spoke approach does not necessarily mean that transit time is increased. In fact, in some cases, it's actually better off. But again, the problem with that is that it comes at an extensive cost. And it's not just laden cargo that you have to pay for, but it's also empty boxes no longer can be moved directly from port to port. And even for empty repositioning, you are going to incur significant relay and transshipment costs. And that's a very expensive network to maintain. And the other problem, again, as I've highlighted earlier, this is the same thing that was caused the failure of the daily Maersk, which lasted only 3.5 years, is that firstly, the market isn't willing to pay a premium for a more reliable service. But also, the fact is that with a shuttle concept service, you can only offer one cutoff a week. And what the carriers would be looking for is more options in terms of the number of cutoffs, in terms of the days of sailing. And this is something which Gemini is going to suffer from as well.
Lars, what's your take?
Yeah, I would take a slightly different take on it because you are starting out. So, well, here we have difference in transit times. I tend to be fairly cynical on this element. And I know there are, of course, nuances, but by and large, shippers care about price.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you are 1 or 2 or 3 days faster or slower, in most cases, doesn't really matter. Whether you are slightly more or less reliable doesn't really matter. Whether you are greener or less green doesn't really matter. The one overarching element that still drives a large part of this industry is very simple. Mm-hmm. What's the price?
Mm-hmm. So some say the Korean shippers are stingy and maybe they're less likely to pay more for premium service. What's your take on that? I heard that a lot.
No, that would not just go for Korean shippers, that would go for shippers everywhere.
Okay. And there's another question from the audience that Mr. Tan, you mentioned that well, the USMX, the employer side of the dock workers negotiation, and the USMX involved shipping lines mostly, and because of that, they will not be actively engaged in negotiation, and it is very likely that they're going to strike, and they wouldn't stop without U.S. government intervention, and thereby shipping lines will enjoy higher rate increase, and I think this question should go to Lars. What's your take on this view?
No, I mean, if you looked at it from the outside, it's very clear. If we get a strike, you are going to see some of the freight rates go up and the carriers are going to make more money than they otherwise would. However, I also am of the view, I don't think the carriers politically can afford to be seen as being the culprits in this. So I think the carriers will do whatever they can to at least have shown, let's say, good faith, so they'll try not to get the blame pinned on them for the strike on happening. But this is a situation where almost all parties stand to benefit from a strike, apart from the shippers involved, because the carriers, they will make more money. And over on the union side, either they will get all their demands, which will be a win for them, or they will get a fight. And if you look at the material that's been sent to all the union members over the last 2 months, it's very clear how they have been using this to glorify their fights over the last 100 years. So for them, actually getting a fight seems to be a win for them as well.
Mm-hmm. We have a few more minutes left. Can we take some questions from the audience? Please raise your hand, and mic runner will be there. And raise your hand and tell your organizations and name. Okay, please.
I'm Samuel from the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore. Thanks so much for the insightful talks. I noticed that, last you mentioned about the fact that now it's getting more chaotic, and therefore it's more about being flexible. At the same time, Mr. Tan, you mentioned about the fact that shippers are not prepared to pay the premium for absolute reliability. So in general, I sense that this direction that we're heading more towards. In the first place, we accept that the world is going to be less reliable, even with more chaotic situation. So we have to plan for more flexibility and more capacity. And you mentioned about how it affects container shipping lines. I was just wondering, coming from a port side, what does this mean for port planning and for ports in general if we have to be more prepared for flexibility? What do you think should be done? Thank you.
Overall, yes. I mean, as ports, you have already seen, let's not focus on the pandemic the last 4 years, because that was such a wild period. But look at the last few years before the pandemic. What you experienced as ports there were also an increasing degree of unpredictability, an increasing amount of blank sailings, inducement calls, vessels that didn't necessarily follow the schedules that were set up. This is also part and parcel even of a world where we don't have all of these different disruptions that we have out there. So from a port perspective, it is about being resilient, and here comes the interesting part. Part of this resilience equals overcapacity. And that boils down to the problem: who is willing to pay for overcapacity? So whilst not then on the ports, but on the carriers, look at Q4 last year. We had overcapacity, absolutely we did. That's why the carriers lost money. Did anybody want to pay for that overcapacity? Certainly not. The shippers were driving rates down. Then we have the contingency, and suddenly we don't have enough capacity. What happens? Well, the carriers, they get paid massively for having that capacity on. This makes for a more unstable market. I think the ports need to also get used to a situation where, in order to remain relevant and competitive, you have to have a certain buffer of overcapacity available. And the reality will be there will be times where that overcapacity will not be profitable for you. But there will be times where that will absolutely be in demand. So how can you then also build your business models around that? It will create a more unstable market, absolutely, but that's the market we're looking into.
Yeah, and if there's one key lesson that we can take away from the last 4 years in the shipping industry, is that whatever can go wrong, it will go wrong. And this is what we saw with the congestion that built up over the last 3 years. And even this year, in the case of Singapore, for example, we saw a significant surge in congestion in the earlier part of this year. And for a port like Singapore, which is always regarded as one of the most efficient in the world, that came as a shock to the industry as well. And that goes back to the point about the shippers' preference for direct services. And I think that's a valid argument to be had. And this is a disadvantage for the Gemini network, because it's going to be reliant on an increased number of feeder and shuttle networks, as well as a heavy reliance on a small number of key hub ports. And if any of that ends up with congestion, for example, that's going to disrupt the entire system. And therefore, I would still have a preference for a more diverse and complete network that has a higher number of direct port-to-port calls compared to one that has a smaller number of direct calls.
More questions from the audience? They giving, okay, ladies.
Hello, I'm Türkan from Port of Baku. We are located on the shore of the Caspian Sea, so we don't have access to ocean. So the corridor that we are located on is called Trans-Caspian Corridor, about which there are discussions that how much of the sea route can go into this route, which is overland from China through Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Europe. So when looking into this situation of Red Sea and before this overcapacity comes, how would you evaluate the chance of cargo shifting to this overland corridor? This is my first question, and let me tell my second question as well. So in the presentations, it was a few times mentioned that there is a surge in demand from South America. Can you elaborate on the reasons of this surge? Thank you.
The overland corridor, the ones that go all the way through Kazakhstan, cross the Caspian, I don't see that as having a huge potential for spillover. First of all, the capacity is relatively limited compared to the all-ocean route. You got a number of different links along the chain there that will also cause a lot of disruption. So I know it's been promoted both by a number of logistics companies and also carriers. I don't see it as having a major kind of an impact, also not going forward at all. Now I just forgot the second question. Oh my God.
On the first point, I think the key is going to be cargo demand. And the problem is that for the Caspian region, the volume of cargo, or at least containerized cargo, at this point is still insufficient to justify the development of additional capacity, whether it's overland, rail, or trucks, or even some waterway connections At this point, I think the volumes does not justify investments into new capacity right now. On the second question, can you
I'm
remind
sorry, I lost it. I
Sorry
received
about
a
that.
text message, so
Oh, the growth in South America. Yeah.
Yeah, so part of that is certainly front-loading. A lot of EV shipments was taking place in the earlier part of the year, and South America, being an emerging market, is not well served by rural capacity at this point. That will be changing as more rural capacity is being built. And that has caused a significant portion, especially for Chinese EVs, but also conventional fuel cars, that's moving into South America in containers. That's one of the key drivers. The other one, of course, is nearshoring. There is certainly a lot of talk about nearshoring, especially for the North American market. That's driving certainly a lot of these Mexican cargo volumes. But also in general, Latin American demand this year, domestically or locally, has been quite strong. The South American economies have been performing relatively well. And so that three elements, front-loading, EVs, nearshoring, as well as domestic demand has been the key drivers behind that growth.
Let me add a comment also on the nearshoring part, because what is one of the key drivers there is also basically a bunch of Chinese manufactured goods that are shipped over to Mexico, assembled there, and then they magically become Mexican goods instead of Chinese goods, allowing them to move into the US without being subject to the Chinese tariffs. And this is where one of the risks for the market is going forward. If you do get for a Trump presidency, it is also exceedingly likely that you will see not just a massive increase in tariffs on China, you might see an enormous tariff wall against Mexico. If that does happen, what then happens to the part of the demand that was Chinese goods moving via Mexico? That will then move likely to Southeast Asia and potentially the Indian subcontinent instead. It will not move home to the US, it will find another home somewhere else.
yeah, we already ran over time. I think the audience are too shy to stand up, but they gave me a text message. So last two questions at a time. This gentleman asked, I think it's a joking question. What happens if Trump gets elected and ILA strike happens at the same time? That was the first question. And second question is, who's gonna be the final winner among the big alliance change? Final winning alliance.
That I wouldn't necessarily put any money on the winning alliance, because I'm not necessarily as negative on the Gemini as Hua Joo is. Mm-hmm. In terms of the ILA, if the ILA strikes lasts all the way to the presidential election, which means it's already been going on for 5 weeks then we are into basically pandemic level disruptions around all the supply chains. It's going to impact all trades around the world. At that point, we're not going to care about a Trump win. We're going to care about supply chains that no longer function.
Okay. And lastly,
yeah, so on the East Coast strike, I think it's almost guaranteed. There's almost 100% certainty that there will be a strike in the East Coast in October. What is unknown for me is how long will the duration of the strike be, because the only solution to this would be a political solution. And at this point, it is very difficult for President Biden to step in to call off the strike, because he cannot be seen to be anti-union. And he can only step in once public opinion in the US shifts sufficiently, when the pain of the strike hits the consumers sufficiently before the president can step in. And so that big question is, how long is that going to take? And that is the big question mark. And on the second question on who the winners would be, I am still extremely impressed with how MSC has achieved its level of growth in the last 5 years especially. Mm-hmm. And given the new loose partnerships that MSC has forged with the former D Alliance and Zim, I would prefer that model, because it's a much more flexible model that is able to take advantage of markets ups and downs compared to the very rigid structure that the Gemini partnership is putting themselves in.
Maybe just a final comment on that one. I think what we could also spend a lot of time on is basically, let's call it the sleeping dragon, a Costco that has done almost nothing since the pandemic started and are lagging behind. My expectation is you are going to see a reinvigorated Costco. You're going to see massive ordering activity from Costco, and that is going to also change the competitive dynamics in relation to the Ocean Alliance.
But to this point on Costco, I think the same dynamics would apply to almost all of the state-controlled carriers, and that would include HMM, it would include Yangming, and to a lesser extent also PIL in Singapore. And the problem with these state-controlled carriers, with Costco being the prime example, is that decisions that these companies make will not be entirely driven by financial decision-making, but it's more going to be influenced by what the political masters want. And this is going to be a particular problem for HMM as well, because if you look at the current investment plan that HMM has just announced, this is coming after a period of significant inactivity in this last 4 years. Since its previous major ship order that was made about 4 years ago, it has made almost no significant new investments in that meantime. And this stop-start approach that a lot of these state-controlled carriers is taking, and that also includes Costco, I think is a very unhealthy one. Because what happens is they tend to invest at the peak of the market instead of catching the right timing. The pressure would be highest on these companies when the market is performing well. And the problem is, when the time these new ships that they order actually come on stream, the market in most cases would have turned downwards by then, and they are always going to be caught out in this vicious cycle.
The added risk there, especially with the Costco, I would tend to agree that at times when you have government-run carriers, they don't necessarily think commercially. I think there's a very high likelihood or risk, depending on how you put it, that Costco is going to be the first carrier to go out and order a new generation of 28,000 TEU vessels. I don't necessarily see a viable commercial future for those vessels, but given the history of this industry, that could trigger a new arms race to a set of vessels that the market in reality doesn't need.
Certainly, I think one of the other drivers behind the political intervention is that it's not just to protect shipping as a strategic industry, but it's also to protect their shipbuilding industry. And this is certainly the case for Korea, as well as China, and maybe Taiwan to a smaller extent. And the problem is when you're trying to pursue multiple objectives like this, which one is going to take precedence? Is shipbuilding more important, or is shipping or the commercial viability of your national shipping line going to take precedence? And that has always been a major problem.
Okay, we ran over a lot of time. Next year, I will allocate more time to session 1. It is very interesting and insightful. Okay, we need to go to lunch. And before that, those who are involved in press interview, please follow me. Okay, let's give a big round of applause to these gentlemen. Okay, I'll wrap up the session. Thank you joining.
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and discussion. And next year, 2 hours will be dedicated. 네, 좋습니다. 네, 그리고 또 저희
So thank you very much. So why don't you give a round of applause to the moderator and also the speakers. With this, we will conclude the morning session.